Hello, and welcome to Screen Tone's Jam Sessions, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. I'm Verathane, my pronouns are she, they, and I make webcomics.
You're supposed to say which web comics.
Oh, uh, sorry, you were jamming so hard, I forgot. I make Geralt and Witchwood.
And I'm Delphina. I use she, her pronouns, and I make the comic Zombulus.
And I am Crispy. My pronouns are she, they, and I make Ghost Junk Sickness and Lunar Blight.
So, for today's jam session, there is a topic that has been kind of on social media lately. It's one of like six different big conversations that are happening, but we just thought this was kind of an interesting one. It's been the subject of kind of writers versus artists. I feel like a big part of this discussion has been kind of coming in from the mainstream printed comics world, and it's entered webcomics discussion because like everybody who makes comics just follows each other and replies to everything. Um, but there's been this sense that writers are more important than artists in comics, which is something that obviously artists push back on. So I guess we'll open it up with the question: which is more important, the writing or the art?
Me. I'm the most important.
I mean, if you're wearing both the hats, then that's technically true.
Webcomics.
Web comics, yes. Yeah, it's a silly question. It's a false dichotomy, especially with web comics, because we're not like separate people usually. Sometimes there are teams of writers and comic creators, but um, it's not an illustrator. It's not. There is a difference between an illustrator and a comic artist because an illustrator is just doing one single illustration, but a comic artist really does have to take in the paneling and the narrative and how things flow visually, and there's so much visual what's the word I want, it's just very important to understand what you're saying and how you're saying it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like it's funny because like Thane mentioned, this is kind of stuff that has been started in the other kind of comic sphere and then bled into web comics. And like we always say, web comic creators have those absolute multitude amounts of hats. We are everything and anything in most cases. Like Delphi said, sometimes we'll have like people that we work with or collaborate with to bring their projects to life. But in, I'm going to say a good almost 99% of webcomics is made by one person.
Just one person makes all the web comics.
Wow, they're very prolific.
And
It's
it's
me.
me.
No. Oh, shoot.
Coming back to that first answer.
No.
Good loop around.
Yeah, but you get a lot of practice when you do comics, and that's like the kind of joy of making web comics is that you do get to do a little bit of everything. So you get both the practice with being an artist and also with being a writer. And if you concentrate on both of those things, I know some people kind of like they redo their art because oh my art's not great. But sometimes it's also important to look at your writing, look at your like clarity of your visuals, your pacing. I love to talk about pacing, but yeah, just all that stuff kind of goes into it, and it's all skills that you can practice and hone, and you should for a more effective comic.
Yeah, and a lot of those skills, like basically, like you were saying, just feed into each other, and they're kind of all required. Now, one really cool thing about webcomics, with the fact that we do wear 5 billion hats, is the fact that, sometimes, actually all the time, you're going to be better at one aspect than you are at the other because you're learning all of these things at the same time, too. So, you can be like this awesome artist, and then, your writing maybe is like the second, like, awesome skill and stuff like that. So, I always encourage when people get into webcomics, they're just like, focus on your best kind of skill in all of these fields, and kind of amplify that with the way that you tackle your story, because that's going to be way much better for you in the long run when you're creating it as well. Now, back to the original point with silly, what is more important? I definitely think, like Thane said, it's just the silliest question or whatever to answer. Controversy to exist, to be quite honest, because the sentiment that has been coming up with that is that there is this really silly belief that the writing aspect of comic making is more labor intensive because it's more emotional. And that's really, really silly, because that insinuates that the creation process of art is not with those same legs.
No, absolutely not.
I feel like it goes in kind of an odd direction though. I feel like the way that the conversation tends to go is that nobody denies that the art making stage requires more like sitting down, actual like nose to the grindstone physical labor. But the way the argument that writing is the more important part is that it's like that spark of genius without which like none of the rest of it could exist, and so of course the writer should always get like top billing in the book uh when it's printed or whatever. It's one of those things, like even in webcomics though there are still like writer artist teams, and there's still like sometimes people will hire like someone to do the art in it, so it's not like it's something that is completely non-existent in the field of webcomics. Like, and then yeah, I feel like one way I've seen it get broken down sometimes is that the art is like the thing that brings people to a project, and then the writing is kind of what makes them stay. Uh, but both components of it are super important, and I feel like something that can get overlooked sometimes is that in comics the art is also the writing. Like the art
Mhm.
is the story, the expressions that the characters are making, and the little details, and like the world building, the way the backgrounds are drawn, the way the panels are like composed. All of these things are also telling the story, and it wouldn't be the same with a different artist, with a different art style. Like it's it's really, they can't be extricated from one another. Which is why I think the conversation about one being more important than the other is like very, very silly in web comics, or
Hmm.
in comics just in general.
Yeah, I think I saw something on Tumblr recently that was like, or what was I'm not a horror fan, so I don't know the one with Michael and Jamie Lee Curtis, but it was that movie.
Halloween?
Yeah, and they did like a remake of it or something like that. So they're showing like um the original scene where he's sneaking up behind and Jamie Lee Curtis is like hiding really scared behind a door, and then a second version where it's her older and like just reshot the same scene. And but the lighting is completely different. The artistry is completely different because they had different tools back then, and it was actually weaker in the later shooting because you could see more of the killer behind her, more of the scene, and just the artistry of that was really uh, just sabotaging the narrative of here's a creepy thing that you can't entirely see coming out of the darkness. And like on paper, if you wanted to just describe what was happening on paper, it's a lady hiding behind a door with a killer coming after her in both scenes. But it was the art that made it different. And that's what we're talking about when we're saying the art is part of the narrative. It is telling you something, it is making you feel something. And so if you're trying to tell me that the writer has the emotional impact in this scenario, I'm just going to say maybe not.
It's the secret spice.
Yeah,
The real secret is that the secret spice is in all the parts.
it's in all of the parts. I mean, yes, the guy had to sneak up and the girl had to be there, but like the the way you present that makes all the difference. It really does.
Yeah, and it takes like, and just to reiterate, like there's no joshing on which side is more important. Like the big thing is that everything has a part to play. Everything has a reason to exist and a weight on the story being told and stuff like that. And just the conversation on the fact that one would be more important, therefore should get more credit and is more emotional and blah 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 is extremely absurd because especially with comics slash web comics is that it takes a whole like performance, a whole theater to make this kind of come true, and everything needs to be weighed like pretty accordingly to this stuff. So to assume that one role is more important than the other in this regard, I don't know, that's this is silly.
It is silly. It's just I don't, as a person who does both the art and the writing, like it's so hard for me to separate that even because
Hmm.
I'll write a script in text and I'll draw it and something I'll draw will be like, "Oh, oh, you know what? That is actually more accurate than the words that I wrote at the on the
Yeah.
paper. This is actually a better direction for me." And I kind of like sift it back and forth. Here's the prose version. Here's the drawing I did. Here's a different version of the prose based on what that is, back and forth until I kind of find the nugget in there. I'm like, yes, this is the emotion I want. This is the impact I want.
Hmm.
This is the scene I want.
Hmm.
I actually, for the first time, just a few weeks ago, I've been trying to do more like shorter, self-contained stories, and as a kind of exercise, while I was trying to put together a pitch, I actually wrote out a script for an entire like graphic novel story, like which I don't normally do in my webcomic process. I generally am only writing like 2 chapters ahead of where I was. But in this case, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to push through and try to get all the way through the entire story. And like, it's very hard for me to look at that, like to think about the final script as being actually final, because while I did make it to the end of it, I still have this like I am convinced that as soon as I actually start drawing, like everything about it is going to change. Like the further and further I got into it, by the time I was at the last chapters, I was like, by the time I'm actually here drawing it, like my whole perspective on the character and the setting, like tiny little things that I wouldn't have thought of otherwise are going to be occurring to me the entire time I'm drawing, and I'm going to want to just like overhaul the entire ending by the time I get there. But without seeing the art, I don't know yet what kind of changes are going to happen, because like just the script alone is like barely half of the actual story, without being able to see it. There's all these little nuances that gradually start adding up, like once you see on the page the character's body language and like their expression. um, it brings to mind totally new ideas that you might not have thought of otherwise. And it's really interesting. It's like part of what I love about comics, that these things are so deeply intertwined with one another, but it makes it really hard to separate the writing from the art, because so much is just baked into the whole process.
I think about like how these kind of come up and they were in like the kind of like published sphere more of comics, I guess I'll say. And I wonder if this conversation comes up because there is a assumption that there's going to be more of an emotional attachment if you are the sole like beginner of the project, because I'm assuming right here myself that a lot of these conversations come from like people who work on teams that are not necessarily like the like what's the word, I
Full
guess.
collaborators.
Yeah, because like, I think of like how I work with space and, Ghost Junk Sickness and Lunar Blight, like we're coming up with that together all at the same time. It's just like, hey, we want a story of some very horribly not good at their job, and space is like, cool, we're gonna do that. And we're both writing and drawing and kind of going on with that, as opposed to like listening to some kind of writer type folks where it's just like, yeah, this is my story and I'm hiring someone outside my sphere to draw it. And I wonder if that's where this like kind of rude assumption that it's just like, well, I'm hiring you outside of my my little bubble of ultimate thought to bring towards my original idea, and therefore because I'm the originator of it, I have more like, you know, attachment and more toiling and more, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like,
Ownership.
yeah, like is it because that they're the originators of this idea that there's now that this kind of like, I don't know, conflict saying this kind of stuff? Like, where does it come from? Where does it
I
go?
I do think that that is kind of the origin of this thing. Like when people don't talk to the people who are involved in the other parts of their process, I guess it can be kind of easy to start to dismiss it. Like if your whole role in the creation of the art is basically to hit send on an email saying like do the art for this,
Yeah.
without having that extra contact. I mean, I hope that more contact does happen between collaborators because they are collaborators.
But you know, I so before Space actually worked on a couple of comics as the colorist, and she worked on a team to bring some comics to light. And they had it all separated out. It was the colorist, it was the line artist, it was the writer, it was the shade person, and then it was also the letterer, and then there was another one. None of them talk to each other. It was all just separate walls, and it's just like, hey, you're the next step in this like thing to
The
kind of happen.
pipeline.
I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, at that point, it's just a job. It's just like, okay, yeah, this is part of my job, and maybe you don't
Yeah.
have a lot of emotional investment in whatever the end product looks like because you will never see it.
Yeah. 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 So to me, it's just like, yeah, that's definitely how projects get done. I mean, it's how a lot of projects get done. But it's so fat headed to also assume that it's just like, this is something that you're going to pursue and at the same time be kind of like, you know, uh, basically look down upon your collaborators in such a way to call it not as thoughtful as like the process that you have a part in and stuff like that, because like that's the only thing I can think of where this would have come from, and the fact that it's spilling into webcomics is really upsetting because we do wear all those hats too, so it has no point here. It really doesn't.
Yeah, yeah. I think Twitter is great at taking things out of their context, and there was a context for this maybe, but it's just I don't know. I think when it spills into web comics, you're exactly right. We have so many roles. Everybody I know who makes a web comic is so thoughtful and so deliberate about what they want to do. Nobody's going in there saying, "Yeah, yeah, I'll do the art because the art part is the thing I love, but the writing I'm just going to phone it in." Like, no, nobody is doing that. Everybody is doing their best and practicing, and when they do that, they're going to get better and better. So, I mean, yeah, there's no it's a false dichotomy for us, I think.
So, in partial response to the debate and also partly just because we think it would be fun, we've thought of a new hashtag challenge for the webcomics community, which would probably be kind of for sometime in the new year would be when everybody could share it. But the hashtag will be draw this script. And basically, we've written up a short script for a 1-page comic. And so the idea of the challenge is that each artist will draw their take on the script, which is just like very basic. You can use your own characters for it, your own story setting, and then if we all kind of post it on social media kind of around the same time, we just thought it'd be really cool to see how different each artist's version of the story, the same script would be. And we'll have more details on that on our social media if you follow us on Twitter at ScreenTonesCast, or check our Tumblr or our Beacons page for more information. We'll be posting about that very soon. Um, anyway, I think that is a wrap on today's jam session. Goat cheese, red pepper, and arugula wrap, which I wrote down for myself and then forgot.
Mm.
Um, I've been Verathane. You can find my comics at chiralt.sevensmith.net or at witchwoodcomic.com.
And I've been Delphina. You can find my comic Zombulus at zombulus.com.
And I'm Crispy. You can find my work at ghostjunksickness.com or lunarblade.com. Peace out, gooberinos.
I'm going to draw comics. I'm going to write comics. I'm going to do both at the same time.
Oh, heck yeah. Type.